The monitor flickered once, then froze. Nurse Marcus Chen's fingers hovered above the keyboard as every muscle in his body locked into place. His eyes widened, pupils dilating as he read the words displayed on the screen. Words that shouldn't exist for an elderly woman lying unconscious in exam room 4. Behind him, Dr. Patricia Walsh leaned forward, her coffee cup stopping halfway to her lips. The emergency room's usual chaos faded into background noise, as they both stared at a military clearance level that neither of them had ever seen before. Not in 15 years of working at County General. Not in any hospital database. The old cashier they'd just admitted, the one found collapsed outside a discount grocery store, still wearing her stained apron and name tag, wasn't supposed to have a file like this. She wasn't supposed to have any file like this. Marcus's hand trembled as he reached for the phone, but Dr. Walsh grabbed his wrist, her voice barely a whisper. Don't. Not yet. We need to understand what we're looking at here. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they both looked toward exam room 4, where an unassuming 72-year-old woman named Dorothy Brennan lay motionless, her weathered hands still bearing the purple bruises from where customers had slammed their groceries onto her conveyor belt just hours ago. Those same hands, according to the file now burning into the hospital's computer screen, had once held clearance for operations that officially didn't exist. Dorothy Brennan had been invisible for decades. That's how she wanted it, and that's how it had been. Every morning at 5:30, she'd wake in her small apartment above the laundromat on Fletcher Street. Make instant coffee in the same chipped mug she'd owned for 20 years. And prepare for another shift at SaveMore grocery. The walk took 15 minutes. She never drove. Driving attracted attention, required insurance paperwork, left digital trails. Walking was better. Anonymous. Safe. Her coworkers barely knew her name. The younger employees, teenagers saving for college, single mothers working double shifts saw her as just another fixture of the store. As permanent and unremarkable as the flickering fluorescent lights in aisle 7. Management tolerated her because she never called in sick, never complained about the schedule, and never asked for raises. To them, she was the perfect employee, cheap, reliable, and utterly forgettable. The customers were worse. Much worse. Move faster, Grandma. Some of us have lives. A woman in yoga pants and designer sunglasses had snapped at her just yesterday, slamming a carton of organic milk onto Dorothy's counter with enough force to make the scanner rattle. Dorothy had simply nodded, her arthritic fingers working as quickly as they could manage, scanning items while the line behind the woman grew longer and more impatient. Can't they hire someone competent? A man in a business suit had muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. He'd been checking his phone, annoyed that Dorothy had needed to call for a price check on his imported cheese. This is ridiculous. It's like they pulled her out of a nursing home. Dorothy had processed his items without comment, her face a mask of patient neutrality that she'd perfected over the years. It was the same expression she'd worn in places these people couldn't imagine, doing things they couldn't fathom. But they didn't need to know that. Nobody needed to know that the store manager, Kyle Henderson, was 28 and had a business degree from a state university he mentioned in every conversation. He treated Dorothy with the particular brand of dismissive condescension reserved for elderly employees he considered too old to understand modern retail dynamics. During the morning staff meeting, he'd spoken slowly and loudly when addressing her, as if volume could compensate for what he assumed was her diminished mental capacity. Dorothy, I need you to really focus on speed today, okay? We've had complaints. Customers say you're too slow. You need to scan faster, bag faster, move faster. Can you do that for me? Do you understand? Kyle had leaned down slightly when he spoke, the way one might address a confused child. Dorothy had looked at him with pale blue eyes that held depths he couldn't begin to perceive. I understand, she'd said simply, her voice quiet and raspy from decades of disuse. What she understood was that Kyle Henderson had never known real pressure, had never made decisions where seconds meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, had never operated in environments where a moment's hesitation could cost lives, But she'd nodded politely and returned to her register, because that was the role she'd chosen. The invisible woman. The forgettable cashier. The person nobody looked at twice. Sarah Martinez, another cashier in her early 20s, had tried befriending Dorothy during the first week of her employment. She'd asked Dorothy about her family, her hobbies, her life outside the store. Dorothy had responded with vague pleasantries and gentle deflections until Sarah eventually gave up, concluding that the old woman was simply too set in her ways to be sociable. Sarah had mentioned to other employees that Dorothy was kind of weird and probably lonely, which was close enough to the truth that Dorothy didn't mind. Loneliness was a small price to pay for anonymity. And anonymity was everything. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon, during the post-lunch rush when the store was packed with impatient customers and every register was operating at capacity. Dorothy had been scanning groceries for a young mother with 2 small children when the woman's credit card declined. Once, twice, 3 times. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Dorothy had said softly. "It's not going through. Do you have another form of payment?" The woman's face had flushed red with embarrassment and frustration. Behind her, the line stretched back into the aisles, and Dorothy could feel the impatience radiating from the crowd like heat from asphalt. A man near the back groaned audibly. Someone else checked their watch with exaggerated obviousness. "Just cancel some items," the young mother had whispered, her eyes glistening. One of her children had begun to cry. Sensing their mother's distress, Dorothy had started removing items as requested, but it wasn't fast enough for the crowd. "Oh my God, this is taking forever!" A woman in the line shouted. "Can we get someone who knows what they're doing? Seriously, how hard is it to scan groceries?" Another voice added. "They need to put her out to pasture." The comments escalated quickly, as they always did when people were hungry, tired, and felt anonymous in a crowd. Someone laughed. Someone else pulled out their phone and started recording. The young mother's humiliation deepened as Dorothy methodically removed items from her order, her arthritic hands moving as quickly as they could manage. That's when Kyle appeared, summoned by the noise and the growing line. He'd taken one look at the situation. Dorothy's register backed up, customers complaining, the young mother on the verge of tears, and made a decision that he thought demonstrated decisive leadership. "Dorothy, you need to speed this up," he'd said, not quietly. "This is exactly what I was talking about in the meeting. You're holding up the entire line." "I'm handling it," Dorothy had replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "You're clearly not," Kyle had shot back. He'd turned to the crowd with an apologetic smile, playing to the audience. "I'm so sorry, everyone. We're working on getting you through as quickly as possible." Then he'd turned back to Dorothy, and his voice had carried across the front of the store. "Maybe it's time we had a serious conversation about whether this position is still right for you. I mean, if you can't handle the basic requirements." Dorothy's hands had stilled on the register. For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, something cold and sharp that hadn't seen daylight in 3 decades. Kyle had noticed it subconsciously, some primal part of his brain recognizing that he'd just crossed an invisible line. But his conscious mind had dismissed the feeling as his imagination. "Just finish this transaction, and then take your break," Kyle had said, his tone making it clear that break might become something more permanent. Dorothy had completed the young mother's reduced order in silence while customers continued their commentary. Someone had posted the video to social media with the caption, "Painful to watch this poor old lady try to work a register. Time to retire, Grandma." It had gotten 40,000 views by the end of the day. After her shift, Dorothy had walked home through the September dusk, her body aching from 8 hours on her feet and her mind unusually active. The humiliation had cracked something inside her, some carefully constructed wall that had kept certain memories at bay. She'd climbed the stairs to her apartment, unlocked the door with hands that trembled slightly, and sat down at her small kitchen table without turning on the lights. In the darkness, the past came flooding back. She was 23 years old again, standing in a briefing room at a location that didn't appear on any map. The men around her, and they were all men then, were silent as she outlined the operation. Her voice clear and confident as she detailed approach vectors, contingency plans, and extraction protocols. She'd been the youngest person in that room and the only woman. But when she spoke, colonels and commanders listened. She was 31. Running through scenarios with recruits who thought they were tough until they met Instructor Brennan. She'd trained them to think 10 steps ahead, to control their fear, to make impossible decisions with incomplete information. Some of them had gone on to command their own units. A few had become legends in the shadowy world where legends weren't supposed to exist. All of them had learned from her. She was 47, sitting across from a general who was begging her to stay for just one more operation, one more mission that only she could lead. She'd declined. She'd already done 24 years, and the nightmares had started coming more frequently. The faces of the people she couldn't save. The weight of decisions that had seemed clear in the moment, but haunted her in the quiet hours before dawn. She'd earned her retirement, and she'd taken it. For 25 years she'd been Dorothy Brennan, cashier. She'd buried Lieutenant Colonel Brennan so deep that sometimes she almost forgot that woman had existed. But sitting in her dark apartment after being humiliated by a 20-8-year-old store manager who'd never faced anything more challenging than quarterly sales projections, Dorothy felt something shift inside her. Not anger. She'd learned to control anger decades ago. It was something colder. Resolve, maybe. Or simply the recognition that her carefully constructed anonymity was becoming its own kind of prison. Her chest had felt tight, strange. She'd stood up to get water, and the room had tilted sideways. The floor had rushed up to meet her. And the last thing Dorothy Brennan remembered was the cold linoleum against her cheek, and the distant sound of her neighbor's television. Through the wall, Mrs. Chen from downstairs had found her 2 hours later, having come up to return a package that had been misdelivered. The ambulance had arrived within 8 minutes. The paramedics had found an elderly woman in worn clothing, dehydrated and malnourished, with a work badge from SaveMore groceries still clipped to her collar. Just another old person who'd been working past retirement age because Social Security wasn't enough to live on. They'd seen dozens like her. They'd loaded her into the ambulance with professional efficiency, starting in 4, checking her vitals, and transported her to County General Hospital with standard protocols. Nobody had looked closely at the small tattoo on her inner wrist, a series of numbers that didn't correspond to any military unit that officially existed. Nobody had noticed the particular way her muscles had maintained their tone despite her age, suggesting decades of disciplined physical training. She'd been admitted as Jane Doe initially. Since she'd had no identification on her, Mrs. Chen had provided her name, and a hospital administrator had typed Dorothy Brennan into the system to create a patient file. That's when everything changed. Marcus Chen, no relation to Dorothy's neighbor, had been working the night shift in the emergency department for 5 years. He'd seen everything from gunshot wounds to heart attacks, from drug overdoses to car crash victims. He processed patients with practiced efficiency, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he input information into the hospital's database. When Dorothy's name populated the search field and he hit enter, he'd expected to see a standard medical history. Maybe some arthritis. Probably high blood pressure, perhaps diabetes. Instead, the screen had erupted with security warnings and access restrictions that Marcus had never encountered. Pop-up boxes demanded additional authentication. The system flagged the file as containing classified information requiring Department of Defense clearance. A red banner across the top of the screen read, "Restricted access. Authorized personnel only." "Dr. Walsh," Marcus had called out, his voice tight. "I need you to look at this." Patricia Walsh had been in emergency medicine for 15 years. She'd treated soldiers on medical leave, veterans with PTSD, and retired military personnel with various service-related injuries. She'd never seen a file like Dorothy Brennan's. "What the hell am I looking at?" Patricia had whispered, leaning over Marcus's shoulder. The portions of the file they could access without Additional clearance were fragmentary, but stunning. Multiple commendations for valor. Training certifications in areas that sounded more like espionage than traditional military service. Service dates spanning from 1973 to 1997. A final rank that made both of them catch their breath. Lieutenant Colonel, Marcus had read aloud. Special Operations Command. Multiple classified deployments. Training roles and... He'd squinted at the screen. Programs I've never heard of. The woman in exam room 4, Patricia, had slowly worked as a cashier at SaveMore. I saw her name tag. I thought she was just another elderly patient who'd overworked herself. They'd both turned to look through the window into exam room 4, where Dorothy Brennan lay unconscious. Her gray hair spread across the pillow, her face lined with age and exhaustion. She looked like anyone's grandmother. She looked utterly ordinary. We need to notify someone, Marcus had said, reaching for the phone. Who? Patricia had asked. There's a number listed here for emergencies, but it's from ... She checked the screen. 1997. That's almost 30 years ago. Whatever unit she was part of probably doesn't exist anymore. Marcus had dialed anyway. The phone had rung 4 times before connecting to an automated system that informed him the number was no longer in service. He'd hung up and tried another number listed in the file. Same result. Try the VA, Patricia had suggested. Veterans Affairs should have updated records. But when Marcus had called the VA and explained the situation, the person on the other end had become suddenly cautious. They'd asked for Dorothy's full name, her service number, and her last known unit. When Marcus had provided the information, there had been a long pause. Sir, I'm going to need to transfer you to a different department, the VA representative had said, their voice carefully neutral. Please hold. Marcus had been transferred 3 times, before finally reaching someone who seemed to have the clearance to discuss Dorothy's file. The conversation had been brief and unsettling. Is the patient conscious? The official had asked. No, she was brought in unconscious. We're treating her for dehydration, exhaustion, and possibly stress-related cardiac symptoms. Do not discuss her service record with anyone who doesn't have proper clearance, the official had instructed. That includes other hospital staff. I'm dispatching someone to your location. They'll be there within 2 hours. Until then, treat her as you would any other patient. But keep her file secured. The call had ended before Marcus could ask any follow-up questions. Dr. Walsh had pulled up a chair beside Dorothy's bed, studying the unconscious woman with new eyes. Who were you? She'd wondered aloud. Dorothy had regained consciousness 6 hours later, waking slowly in the unfamiliar hospital room with its beeping monitors and antiseptic smell. Her first instinct had been to assess her situation. Location, potential threats, exit routes. Then she'd remembered. She was 72 years old. She was a cashier. She'd collapsed. The old training had kicked in automatically, but it wasn't needed here. A nurse, young, kind-faced, efficient, had noticed her stirring. Welcome back, Miss Brennan. I'm Rachel. You're at County General Hospital. You collapsed at home, and your neighbor called 911. Do you remember that? Dorothy's throat had been dry, her voice raspy. Water? Rachel had helped her take small sips through a straw. The doctor will want to see you now that you're awake. You gave us quite a scare. Dr. Walsh had arrived within minutes, accompanied by Nurse Marcus. They'd both looked at Dorothy with an expression she recognized from long ago. Cautious respect mixed with intense curiosity. Ms. Brennan. Dr. Walsh had begun carefully. How are you feeling? Tired, Dorothy had answered honestly. Thirsty. What happened? You collapsed from severe dehydration and exhaustion. Your potassium levels were dangerously low, and your blood pressure was elevated. When's the last time you had a proper meal? Dorothy had thought about it. Really thought about it. I don't remember. The truth was, she'd been skipping meals to make her grocery budget stretch further. The rent on her apartment had increased twice in the past year, and her Social Security check only went so far. She'd been eating once a day, sometimes less, and drinking instant coffee instead of buying proper food. It had seemed manageable until it wasn't.
"We've been giving you fluids and nutrients intravenously," Dr. Walsh had continued.
"You're going to need to stay here for at least 48 hours while we monitor your condition." "But, Miss Brennan, I need to ask you something." She'd paused, choosing her words carefully. "When we entered your information into our system, some unusual flags came up. Your medical records are ... restricted." Dorothy's expression hadn't changed, but something had shifted behind her eyes.
"That was a long time ago. The system indicates you should contact a specific department if you're hospitalized."
We tried calling the numbers on file, but most of them are disconnected. However, we did reach someone at the VA who said they're sending a representative.
"That won't be necessary," Dorothy had said quietly.
"I'm retired. I have been for 25 years.
Marcus had stepped forward, unable to contain his curiosity any longer.
"Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, the file said you were a lieutenant colonel
in special operations." Dorothy had looked at him with those pale blue eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine.
"I was a lot of things. Now I'm a cashier at a grocery store. Or I was until yesterday." The contempt in her own voice when she'd said cashier had been impossible to miss. Not contempt for the work, honest work was honest work, but contempt for what she'd allowed herself to become. A ghost, a shell of a person who'd once been extraordinary. Why? Dr. Walsh had asked the question softly, genuinely confused. "Why were you working at SaveMore?"
"Your military pension alone should be a lot of things," Dorothy had interrupted.
"Turns out there were complications with my benefits.
Paperwork from my service that got lost or misclassified.
I've been fighting with the VA for years to get it straightened out.
In the meantime, I needed to eat and pay rent, so I got a job. SaveMore was hiring."
They didn't ask too many questions. The door had opened, and a man in a dark suit had entered. He'd looked to be in his 50s,
with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent their life in service. He'd nodded to Dr. Walsh and Marcus, then turned his attention to Dorothy.
"Colonel Brennan," he'd said, and it wasn't a question. Dorothy had studied him for a moment.
"I don't know you." "No, ma'am, you wouldn't."
"I'm Robert Hawkins, Defense Department Liaison. I was asked to check on your condition and see if there's anything you need."
25 years, Dorothy had said dryly.
"I could have used this service any time in the past 25 years.
But now that I've ended up in a hospital, suddenly the Department of Defense cares."
Hawkins had had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I understand your frustration, Colonel. Your file was... There were administrative issues that prevented your benefits from being processed correctly.
It's being addressed now. Now that I triggered some alarm in a hospital database," Dorothy had finished for him.
"Because God forbid an officer with my clearance level dies without anyone noticing. Might look bad." Dr. Walsh and Marcus had exchanged glances,
unsure whether they should leave and give Dorothy and Hawkins privacy.
Hawkins had pulled up a chair beside Dorothy's bed, speaking in a low voice that nevertheless carried clearly in the small room. "Colonel, I want to be straight with you. When your name hit the system last night, it created ripples. A lot of people are very interested in your well-being. People who forgot I existed for 2.5 decades.
People who didn't know you existed," Hawkins had corrected gently.
"Your service record is sealed at a level that very few people have access to.
When you retired, you essentially disappeared into civilian life, which is what you wanted.
But the administrative separation from service wasn't handled properly. Your benefits should have been processed. They weren't. That's on us and we're fixing it." Dorothy had closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted despite having just woken up.
"I don't want to be a project or a problem to be fixed.
I just want to live quietly."
"I understand."
"But, Colonel, you're living in poverty. Working a minimum wage job at 72 years old.
Skipping meals because you can't afford groceries.
That's not acceptable for someone who served the way you did." Dr. Walsh had interjected, unable to hold back any longer. "What exactly did you do? If you can tell us?" Dorothy and Hawkins had both looked at her.
Hawkins had spoken first. She trained some of the most elite operatives in the US military. She planned and executed missions that prevented catastrophic threats to national security. She did things that can't be discussed, in places that officially don't exist, for reasons that remain classified. I taught people how to think under pressure, Dorothy had added quietly. How to make impossible decisions. How to live with the consequences. Marcus had found his voice.
And then you ended up scanning groceries at SaveMore while customers yelled at you for being too slow.
The room had fallen silent. The sheer absurdity and injustice of it had hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Hawkins had stood, pulling a business card from his pocket and setting it on Dorothy's bedside table. "Colonel, I'm going to make sure your benefits are processed immediately. You'll receive full back pay for the years they were withheld, plus your correct pension going forward. You're going to have healthcare, housing assistance if you need it, and access to VA resources that should have been available all along. I don't want special treatment," Dorothy had said.
"This isn't special treatment. It's what you're entitled to. What you earned."
After Hawkins had left, Dr. Walsh had sat down in the chair he'd vacated.
"Miss Brennan, Colonel Brennan, can I ask you something personal?"
Dorothy had nodded slightly. "How did you end up at SaveMore?"
"I mean, I understand about the benefits issue, but didn't you have friends? Fellow soldiers? Someone who could have helped?" Dorothy had been quiet for a long moment before answering.
"When you do the kind of work I did, you learn to separate yourself from normal life.
The people I worked with, the operations we ran. We couldn't talk about them with friends or family.
We couldn't form the normal bonds that civilians take for granted.
After I retired, I didn't maintain those military connections because I wanted a clean break. I wanted to be normal, invisible, safe."
"But you ended up isolated instead," Dr. Walsh had said gently. "Yes, I suppose I did." Marcus had pulled out his phone, typing something quickly.
"Ma'am, there's a video of you.
From SaveMore.
Someone posted it online yesterday. I think you should see it."
He'd handed her the phone.
Dorothy had watched the video of herself at the register, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process the young mother's transaction while customers
shouted insults and her manager berated her. The video had been viewed over 200,000 times now.
The comments section was brutal. Dorothy had handed the phone back.
"I look very old. You look like someone who's been ground down by a system that doesn't value experience or dignity," Dr. Walsh had said firmly. "You look like thousands of elderly people who have to keep working because they can't afford to retire. Who get treated like they're disposable by people young enough to be their grandchildren."
"I was disposable," Dorothy had said matter-of-factly. "Once my active service ended, I became a line item in a budget.
A benefits calculation.
A file that could be misfiled and forgotten." Over the next 2 days, Dorothy had remained in the hospital while they stabilized her health.
The story of her background had leaked, as stories inevitably do in the age of social media.
Someone at the hospital had mentioned to someone else who'd mentioned to a friend who'd posted about it online.
Within 48 hours, the narrative had completely transformed.
The painful-to-watch video of an old cashier struggling at her register had been paired with her military service record.
News outlets had picked up the story. Decorated Special Ops Colonel was working at grocery store while VA failed to process her benefits, read one headline. They mocked her for being slow. She trained America's most
elite warriors, read another. The response was immediate and overwhelming.
SaveMore's corporate office had been bombarded with phone calls and emails demanding that Kyle Henderson be fired.
The video of him berating Dorothy had been shared millions of times, always with her military background as context.
Customers who'd shouted insults at her were being identified and publicly shamed.
The young mother Dorothy had been helping had come forward to defend her, explaining that Dorothy had been patient and kind while others had been cruel.
Kyle Henderson had resigned before he could be fired, issuing a public apology that no one believed was sincere.
SaveMore had announced new policies for treating elderly employees with respect and had made
a significant donation to veteran services in Dorothy's name. On Dorothy's third day in the hospital, she'd had an unexpected visitor. The young mother from the grocery store had appeared in her doorway, holding flowers and looking nervous. "Ms. Brennan? I'm Jennifer. From SaveMore. I don't know if you remember me, but you were helping me when ... When everything happened." Dorothy had gestured for her to enter. "I remember. How are your children?" Jennifer had started crying. "I came to apologize. For everything. For being part of that situation, for not defending you when people were saying those awful things. I was so embarrassed about my card declining that I didn't stand up for you, and I should have. I should have told everyone to shut up and leave you alone. You were struggling with your own problems," Dorothy had said gently. "You have nothing to apologize for. I found out who you are. What you did. And I feel even worse because you spent your career protecting people like me, and then when you needed basic human decency, nobody gave it to you." Dorothy had taken Jennifer's hand, surprising them both. "I didn't tell you this then, but I wanted to. Whatever you're going through, it will pass. Those moments when your card declines, when you can't afford everything your children need, when you feel like you're failing, they're temporary. You're doing your best, and that's all anyone can do." Jennifer had wiped her eyes. "The video went viral, you know? People are saying such nice things about you now. And really angry things about everyone who was mean to you. Is that weird? Does it help?" Dorothy had considered the question. "I spent most of my career with nobody knowing what I did or where I was. Being invisible was part of the job. Part of the job. Then I retired and stayed invisible because I didn't know how to be anything else. Now everyone knows my name and my face, and it's strange. Uncomfortable. But maybe..." She'd paused, thinking. "Maybe it's not about me. Maybe it's about all the elderly people working jobs that don't pay enough. Being treated poorly by people who assume age equals incompetence. If my story makes people think about that, then maybe some good comes from it." After Jennifer had left, Dr. Walsh had returned with discharge papers and a serious expression. "Your labs look much better. You're physically stable enough to go home, but I have concerns about you returning to that apartment and that lifestyle. The malnutrition was severe, Dorothy. If you go back to the same situation, this will happen again. Mr. Hawkins said the benefits issue is being resolved. It is. I followed up with him. Your back pay should be processed within 2 weeks, and your correct pension will start immediately. But in the meantime, where are you going? What are you eating? Do you have support?" Dorothy had opened her mouth to respond when her phone, which Mrs. Chun had kindly brought to the hospital, had buzzed with a text message. Then another. And another. She'd picked it up, confused, and found dozens of messages from numbers she didn't recognize. One was from a retired general she'd trained within. 1984. Another was from a former student, who was now a high-ranking official in the intelligence community. Others were from fellow veterans she'd served with, people she hadn't spoken to in decades. They'd all seen the news. They'd all been horrified. And they all wanted to help. "Ma'am, I'm having a guest room prepared at my home for you," read one message from a former colonel she'd mentored in the early 90s. "Please say you'll stay with my family until your situation is settled. Colonel Brennan, I've contacted my connections at the VA to personally expedite your case." Read another. "This should never have happened. We take care of our own. I have job opportunities for you if you want to come out of retirement." Read a third. "Training roles, consulting work, speaking engagements. You have skills that are still valuable." Dorothy had stared at her phone, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of support from people she thought had forgotten. Her Dr. Walsh had read a few of the messages over her shoulder and smiled. "Looks like you're not as alone as you thought," she'd said. "I don't know what to say to them," Dorothy had admitted. "I've been alone so long, I don't remember how to accept help. Start with thank you and go from there." Dorothy had spent the next hour responding to messages, accepting the offer of temporary housing, thanking people for their concern, and slowly reconnecting with a community she'd cut herself off from a quarter-century ago. It felt strange, vulnerable, but also, unexpectedly, like coming home. When Robert Hawkins had returned that evening to check on her, He'd found Dorothy sitting up in bed, her phone in hand. A slight smile on her face for the first time since she'd been admitted. "You look better, Colonel," he'd observed.
"I'm starting to remember who I was," she'd replied.
"Before I convinced myself that I needed to disappear."
"The thing about people like you,"
Hawkins had said,
"is that you can't disappear completely. Eventually, the world catches up with you."
In this case, it took a hospital database and a viral video. But here we are. Dorothy had agreed.
"I have news about your benefits. Everything is being fast-tracked.
You'll have full back pay deposited within 10 business days, and your monthly pension is being corrected as we speak. Additionally, the VA is issuing a formal apology for the administrative failures that led to this situation."
An apology doesn't erase 25 years of poverty and isolation?
No,
it doesn't. But it's a start. And, Colonel, there's something else. The video from SaveMore has sparked a larger conversation about how we treat elderly employees and veterans. Several organizations have reached out asking if you'd be willing to speak publicly about your experience. No pressure, but if you wanted to use your platform to advocate for others in similar situations, you'd have a significant audience.
Dorothy had been quiet, considering.
For so long, she'd wanted nothing more than to be invisible, to avoid attention, to live quietly. But invisibility had turned into isolation, and isolation had nearly killed her. Maybe it was time for a different approach.
"I'll think about it," she'd said. 3 weeks later, Dorothy Brennan stood at a podium in front of a congressional
subcommittee hearing on veterans' benefits and the treatment of elderly workers. Her gray hair was neatly styled, and she wore a simple but professional outfit.
Her voice, which had been barely above a whisper for years, was clear and strong as she addressed the room.
"My name is Dorothy Brennan.
I retired as a lieutenant colonel from the United States Army,
after 24 years of service in positions that I still cannot fully discuss. I served my country with pride and dedication, and I believed that when my service ended, the country would honor its commitments to me. I was wrong."
She'd gone on to detail the administrative failures that had left her without proper benefits.
The years of appeals and paperwork that went nowhere. The eventual resignation to poverty and minimum wage work.
But she'd also made it clear that her story was just one of thousands.
"I'm here today not because I'm special, though the media attention has made me a symbol. I'm here because I'm a reminder.
When we allow our veterans to slip through the cracks,
when we fail to process their benefits correctly, when we create systems so complex and bureaucratic that elderly people give up trying to navigate them, we fail our most basic obligations. And when we create an economy where 72-year-olds have to work retail jobs to survive, where customers feel entitled to mock and degrade elderly employees, where being old is treated as an inconvenience rather than a sign of experience and dignity, we fail as a society." Her testimony had been powerful and had led to immediate calls for reform. The VA had announced new streamlining procedures for benefits processing. Several major retailers had implemented new training programs, focused on age discrimination and respect for elderly employees. Dorothy's story had become a catalyst for change, but perhaps the most significant change was the personal one. Dorothy had moved into temporary housing with a retired colonel and his wife, people she'd known briefly during her service. They'd insisted she stay as long as she needed, and for the first time in decades, Dorothy had experienced what it meant to be part of a community again. She'd attended veteran support groups, reconnected with former colleagues, and slowly rebuilt the social connections she'd deliberately severed a quarter-century earlier, when her back pay had come through a substantial sum representing years of withheld benefits. Dorothy had made several decisions. She'd rented a proper apartment in a safe neighborhood with reliable heat and working appliances. She'd bought nutritious food and cooked real meals. She'd scheduled regular doctor's appointments and started physical therapy for her arthritis. She'd donated a significant amount to organizations supporting elderly workers and veterans in transition, and she'd accepted a consulting position with a veterans advocacy organization.
using her experience and her newfound public platform to help others navigate the systems that had failed her. 6 months after her collapse outside SaveMore grocery, Dorothy Brennan returned to the store for the first time. Not to work, but to shop. She dressed simply jeans, a comfortable sweater, her military service pin on her collar, and walked through the automatic doors with her shoulders straight and her head high. The store had changed. New management had implemented the corporate reforms, and there were signs posted about treating all employees with respect. The staff seemed younger, more diverse, and notably, there were several elderly employees working various positions who appeared to be treated with genuine courtesy by both management and customers. Dorothy had selected her groceries carefully, choosing fresh vegetables and good cuts of meat, items she'd once considered luxuries. When she'd approached the checkout lanes, she'd deliberately chosen the register staffed by an elderly man who moved slowly but with practiced efficiency. "Good afternoon," he'd greeted her warmly, his name tag reading Harold. "Good afternoon, Harold," Dorothy had replied, and then, because she couldn't help herself, she'd asked, "How long have you been working here?" "Just started 3 months ago," he'd said, scanning her items at a measured pace. "Needed something to supplement my pension. But I have to say, this place treats us well. Better than my last job anyway. They have this whole new program about respecting senior employees. Guess there was some incident a while back that changed things." Dorothy had smiled. "I heard about that. The lady in question, she really made a difference. Don't know where she is now, but I hope she's doing all right. She stood up for people like us, even if she didn't mean to. I think she's doing much better," Dorothy had said softly. As Harold had bagged her groceries, slowly, carefully, with arthritic hands that reminded her of her own, a young man in line behind. Dorothy had sighed audibly and checked his phone with impatience. But before he could say anything, another customer, an older woman, had turned to him sharply. "He's doing his best. If you're in such a hurry, you should have used self-checkout." The young man had looked embarrassed and had mumbled an apology. Harold had smiled at Dorothy as he'd handed her the receipt, and she'd seen in his eyes the quiet dignity of someone who'd lived a full life and deserved to finish it with respect. On her way out, Dorothy had passed the customer service desk where a new store manager, woman in her 40s with kind eyes, had been helping an elderly customer with a return. The manager had looked up, caught Dorothy's eye, and something in her expression suggested she knew exactly who Dorothy was. She'd nodded respectfully, and Dorothy had nodded back. Outside, the spring sunshine had been warm on Dorothy's face. She'd loaded her groceries into the car she'd recently purchased, a modest used sedan that was reliable and safe, and had sat for a moment before starting the engine. Reflecting on how much had changed, her phone had buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Walsh. "How are you doing? Thinking about you today." Dorothy had typed back, "I'm doing well. Really well. Thank you for everything." Another message had come through, this one from Marcus, the nurse who'd first discovered her military record. "My mom is a veteran having trouble with her benefits. Would you be willing to talk to her about resources? No pressure." "Of course," Dorothy had replied. "Have her call me anytime." This was her life now. Not invisible, not isolated, but connected. Purposeful. She was still Dorothy Brennan, but she was also Colonel Brennan again in the ways that mattered. She helped other veterans navigate the system. She spoke at events about age discrimination and the dignity of work. She mentored younger people entering military service, sharing lessons learned from decades of experience. She'd even started writing a book, not about her classified operations, which would remain classified, but about leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of their position or age. Her literary agent said publishers were very interested, but perhaps most importantly, she'd learned to accept help, to be part of a community, to understand that strength wasn't only about what you could endure alone, but also about knowing when to let others support you. One evening, she'd attended a dinner at the home of the colonel who'd taken her in after her hospitalization. Around the table were a dozen other veterans, ranging from recently discharged soldiers in their 20s to men and women in their 80s who'd served in Vietnam. They'd shared stories, laughed, argued about military strategy, and created the kind of camaraderie that Dorothy had thought she'd left behind forever. As she'd driven home that night, Dorothy had thought about the journey that had brought her here. The humiliation at SaveMore that had seemed like rock bottom had actually been a turning point. The collapse that could have killed her had instead saved her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. She'd spent 25 years trying to disappear, believing that invisibility equaled safety and peace. But she'd learned that invisibility could also mean isolation, poverty, and a slow erosion of dignity and purpose. Being seen, really seen for who she'd been and who she still was, had been terrifying at first. But it had also been liberating. The woman who'd once trained elite operatives to survive impossible situations had needed to learn how to survive an ordinary life. And she'd discovered that ordinary life, lived with connection and purpose and dignity, was its own kind of extraordinary. Dorothy Brennan was 72 years old. She was a retired lieutenant colonel. She was a veteran's advocate. She was a friend, a mentor, and an example of resilience. She'd served her country in the shadows for decades, and now she was serving it in the light, making sure that others wouldn't fall through the same cracks that had almost consumed her. And every time she went grocery shopping, she made a point to choose the slowest checkout line, staffed by the oldest employee, and to thank them sincerely for their service, whether that service was military or simply the honest work of showing up and doing their job with dignity, despite a world that often didn't appreciate either. The monitor that had frozen when Nurse Marcus first entered her name now displayed a comprehensive medical file, updated regularly, with all her benefits properly documented and accessible. But more than that, it displayed a life reclaimed, a dignity restored, and a reminder that every person, regardless of age, regardless of their current circumstances, has a story worth knowing, and a value that goes far beyond what can be captured in a database. Sometimes the people we overlook, the elderly workers we rush past with impatience, the quiet individuals who seem unremarkable, sometimes they're heroes who've simply learned to be invisible. And sometimes it takes a moment of crisis and a viral video for the world to remember that every person deserves to be seen, respected, and valued for the full measure of their humanity. Dorothy Brennan had learned that lesson the hard way. But in learning it, she'd become a teacher once more, helping society understand that dignity isn't something you earn through recognition or lose through obscurity. It's something inherent to being human, and it's something we all need to protect in ourselves and in others. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how we treat the elderly people in our communities, the veterans who served our country, or anyone who's been made to feel invisible by a society that sometimes values youth and speed over experience and wisdom, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being mistreated because of their age? Have you learned something surprising about someone you'd initially overlooked? Share your stories. And if you believe that every person deserves dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances, please consider supporting organizations that help veterans and elderly workers navigate the systems that too often fail them. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness, patience in a checkout line, a word of encouragement, a moment of genuine recognition can make all the difference. Thank you for listening to Dorothy's story. Let's make sure that no one else has to suffer in silence the way she did.